Okay, the next item of business is a debate on motion 17074 in the name of Stuart McMillan on behalf of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee on inquiry into framework legislation and Henry VIII powers. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And I call on Stuart McMillan to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the committee. Mr McMillan, around 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, I am grateful today to have an opportunity to discuss the work of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee's inquiry into framework legislation and Henry VIII powers. The genesis of the inquiry was a genuine desire of the committee to look at the issue of framework legislation itself. We hoped by taking a step back from any particular bill, with the detail and policy context, we would be able to look at the bigger picture. This was, we hoped, a way to slightly depoliticise the issue, recognising that framework legislation has been used by governments of all stripes over the years and not just in the Scottish Parliament. Indeed, the Chair of the House of Lords Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee, Lord McLaughlin, who we met on our committee fact-finding visit to London, compared the change in views in relation to framework legislation between being in opposition and also being in government as being akin to a Damascene convergence, with oppositions generally being against and government in favour of legislating in such a way whichever political party is in charge. Now, though, of course, we also recognise that there is a genuinely held concern by some members in this Parliament about framework elements in bills which have come forward this session, and a perception that these are becoming more common. So we set out to examine a number of key questions, including, first of all, whether framework legislation can be defined, secondly, whether it is indeed becoming more common, and thirdly, also what might be done to improve scrutiny. This was for both framework primary legislation and framework powers being used to make secondary legislation. In seeking to explore these questions, the committee was indebted to the thoughtful and interesting responses we received to our work. As the Chamber will know, we heard directly from the conveners of both the Finance and Public Administration Committee, Kenneth Gibson MSP, and also the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee, Finlay Carson MSP, and I'm pleased that I believe that Finlay Carson is speaking in the debate this afternoon as the convener of the committee. We also heard from other legislatures across the world, including from colleagues across the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. As members know, I value the work and engagement of the CPA very highly. The committee was also greatly helped in its work with views from key stakeholder organisations at the heart of Scottish policymaking, leading academics and think tanks, and also eminent legal bodies. On behalf of all the committee members, I'd like to thank everyone who gave their time providing the committee with written responses and speaking with the committee both informally and also as a witness. While issues relating to delegated powers may not be widely understood or discussed outside of the political, legal and policy bubbles, the level and quality of the engagement clearly demonstrates just how important scrutiny of delegated powers actually is, and should impress upon all parliamentarians the need to carefully consider delegated powers in the context of scrutinising a bill. I will repeat the comment that I have said in the Chamber in the past, and I recommend that every member spends time on the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, as it clearly does increase the understanding and appreciation of how legislation and how our Parliament work. In delegated power, the Parliament is giving away the power to create law in a certain area. Achieving the right balance, ensuring powers are only delegated appropriately and that appropriate safeguards are in place, is an important undertaking, and we are glad to see that this significance is understood by many colleagues and also stakeholders. There's been a lot of discussion about what we mean by framework legislation, and during the evidence session on the 21st of January with Finlay Carson and Kenneth Gibson, Mr Carson during the session highlighted the difficulty perfectly as he alluded to two different definitions of framework legislation. This highlights the key challenge that politicians face when it comes to framework legislation. And after listening to stakeholders, the committee concluded that while there might not be a single definition, and that even with a definition there is still scope for reasonable disagreement and grey areas as to whether a provision in a bill meets it, it's possible to set out what framework legislation is. We concluded, therefore, that it is, and I quote from the report, legislation that sets out the principles for a policy but does not include substantial detail how that policy will be given practical effect. Instead, this type of legislation seeks to give broad powers to ministers or others to fill in this detail at a later stage. Now, as Parliament... Sure?
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Stuart McMillan giving way on that point, and I compliment the committee on the report. With regard to the definition of framework legislation, do the committee agree that actually a definition, however flawed, is still very valuable when we come to look at the other steps with regard to scrutiny of framework bills that may be necessary that differ from other bills?
Stuart McMillan.
Yes, but I think the fact we managed to get to some type of definition I think is an indication of that. But we also generally recognised how challenging it was to actually get to a definition too. And certainly some of the evidence that we heard was conflicting, understandably. So as parliamentarians, we think most of our colleagues will know a piece of framework legislation when they see it, but nonetheless we hope by setting out our understanding of it, we can help to inform debate. And it's also worth acknowledging that the Scottish Government has noted in its response that this description reflects the broad consensus of views amongst academics and also practitioners. And as to the frequency, the committee heard varied views once again. Now, there's a general acceptance that the occurrence of framework legislation is not diminishing, but without a universal agreed definition or a single way of counting framework legislation over time, it's not possible to give a definitive answer. But on balance, the committee considers that across jurisdictions it's likely the occurrence of framework legislation has increased, taking the 1932 report of the Donoughmore Committee on Ministers' Powers as our starting point, and that this trend seems to be increasing. Now, indeed, speaking of the Donoughmore Committee, which was established in 1929 and reported in 1932, it was reassuring to know that we are not the first parliamentarians to concern ourselves with the issue of ministers' powers. We certainly we are not going to know whether this committee's report is going to be considered in 93 years' time. But the age of this report into what is substantially the same subject does speak to the fact that this is not a new issue or one peculiar to Scotland. Now, in terms of scrutinising bills, the committee agreed that its own preference, wherever possible, is for the detail of legislation to be spelled out on the face of the bill, to allow for transparency, for proper democratic engagement, and also so that stakeholders and parliamentarians can engage with and scrutinise solid proposals. Now, that said, the committee recognises the need, in some cases, for primary legislation to provide flexibility by allowing for laws to be updated without requiring further bills. In such cases... Sure.
Stephen Kerr.
This might be an unfair question to ask the convener, but he said that dealing with framework legislation made Scotland no different in terms of our parliamentary experiences. But does the structure of the Scottish Parliament, which has some unique features, does that make us more weak in terms of scrutinising the secondary legislation that comes about because of the nature of framework acts?
Stuart McMillan, and give you the time back for the intervention.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So obviously I am speaking today on behalf of the committee, and I did touch upon my comments initially about trying to look at this to depoliticise elements of the issue that we're discussing. So I'll have my own personal views, and I'm happy to speak to Mr Kerr about them afterwards. But on those particular issues, we didn't go into that level of great detail with regards to the functions and the structure, really, of the Scottish Parliament. So, but we can have a chat after. That's not a bother. So I think certainly the report sets out in detail the steps which the committee supports been taken by both government and also fellow parliamentarians to actually help to try to strengthen the issue regarding the primary legislation delegated and also the power and subsequent secondary legislation being made under it. Now, such steps include the use of the so-called super-affirmative procedures for subordinate legislation and also overarching justifications being set out by the Scottish Government in instances where it decides to take a framework approach. Now, finally, the committee concluded that while it expects to see so-called Henry VIII powers, and that is powers which allow for primary legislation to be amended by secondary legislation, appropriately limited in scope, it considers them a necessary, efficient tool when used suitably. Now, at present, it's generally content with the drafting of most Henry VIII powers in the Scottish Government bills, and that they are subject to appropriate parliamentary procedures. And at this point, I will put one personal point on the record, that I personally don't like the issue, or the idea of Henry VIII powers, but I do recognise and I do agree with what we as a committee found unanimously. But, Presiding Officer, to conclude, I hope that the committee's report proves to be helpful to the Parliament and beyond in the longer term and the basis for an interesting and informative debate this afternoon. And I thank my committee colleagues for the way that they worked throughout the whole inquiry, and I look forward to hearing contributions from other members also. I also want to put on the record my thanks to the committee members, to the excellent clerking team. My thanks on behalf of the committee members to the excellent clerking team and the legal advisers of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. Their assistance during this inquiry certainly was invaluable, and I know that we all appreciate everything that they have undertaken to help us in our actions. So with that, Presiding Officer, I'm happy to move the motion in my name. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr McMillan. Before calling the next speaker, I can advise the Chamber that we have quite a bit of time in hand, so members can assume that generosity will be baked into the speaking time allocations. With that, and with some trepidation, I call Finlay Carson to speak on behalf of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee. Around 6 minutes, Mr Carson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I welcome this opportunity to speak in the important debate on both the DPLR Committee's recent report on framework legislation and the wider issue of its impact on parliamentary business and, crucially, effective committee scrutiny. I was pleased to give evidence to the DPLR Committee in its course of its inquiry, together with Kenneth Gibson. I'll begin with a quick summary of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee submission to the DPLR Committee's inquiry. Stuart McMillan has already set out that the committee defined framework legislation in its inquiry, but the Rural Affairs Committee used a slightly broader definition, and I quote, "Primary legislation which sets out broad powers with the details of how these powers would be used and implemented to be set out at a later date, either through secondary legislation or through other documents to be laid in Parliament." This broader definition encompasses primary legislation which requires the Scottish Ministers to lay a document in Parliament and which may be subject to parliamentary scrutiny and approval. I understand why the DPLR Committee's inquiry focused on primary and secondary legislation, but from a broader parliamentary and subject committee perspective, the RAE Committee feels these other laid documents which set out the detail of the government policy are equally important. The RAE Committee agrees there is a place for framework legislation where the legislative powers will be required for the long term, but flexibility is required on how these will be exercised. Certainly.
Michelle Thompson.
Thank you very much for giving way. I'm very interested to hear of your definition, and I think that would probably concur with a definition had the FPA committee been asked to give one, because that is also what we are seeing, and maybe the fact that we're coming to it from a different steer, if you like. Obviously, the DPLR committee is quite focused on the absolutism of what we have in terms of standing orders, but this is a practical effect, what the member's describing, that I think we would say in our committee.
Finlay Carson.
Yeah, thanks for that intervention. Absolutely. We found that over the course of this session that in some cases it's crucial how the likes of guidance or good practice guidelines are set out in the second legislation. These often don't come under the scrutiny. And we've seen in some instances, particularly with the likes of Nature Scott, where there's some believe that the guidance means that some of the legislation, in effect, goes above and beyond what the spirit of the legislation was passed in the Parliament intended. Excuse me. The RAE Committee agrees there is a place for this legislation, but we need the long-term flexibility. An example is last year's Agriculture and Rural Communities Scotland Act, which gave ministers power to provide agricultural support, but which, in order for this support to be fit for purpose over the longer term, we needed flexibility via regulations. However, without much detail about how the powers would be exercised and how much this would cost the public purse, it's very difficult for Parliament to take a view on the general principles of this framework legislation. So what solutions did we put forward to this scrutiny challenge? Well, we suggest detailed information about the appropriateness, the impact and costs of the proposed powers or laid documents in this primary legislation and/or accompanying documents. As the DPLR Committee also recommended consideration of the wider use of the super-affirmative procedure, or other opportunities for enhanced scrutiny for proposed powers in framework bills, although this option should be used carefully. A lighter touch stage 1 scrutiny, as long as it establishes and enables parliamentarians to take a view on the general principles. A presumption that statutory duties on Scottish ministers to produce a plan should be accompanied by a requirement to lay the documents in Parliament for a period of a certain number of days to allow for any parliamentary scrutiny. And we believe it would be appropriate for some laid documents to be subject to parliamentary approval. Over the course of this session, we have found a wide variation of requirements for laid documents. Some consistency, or at least explicit logic, for these variations would inform and help with scrutiny. A commitment to co-design with key stakeholders was important, and again, as the DPLR committee also recommended, a presumption that the Scottish ministers must review the effectiveness of regulation or other laid documents made under this framework legislation. I would like to finish my contribution by complimenting the DPLR committee's report with the perspective of a subject committee tasked with scrutinising the output of framework legislation. In our submission to the inquiry, we set out the challenges of scrutinising regulations within the 40-day period and called for the accompanying policy notes to set out better financial information. I would like to have seen these challenges facing Parliament explored in more detail in the report. I will conclude with a point I have raised a number of times, especially in the conveners group, around the lack of oversight or coordination of the regulations or other laid documents. At its heart, this issue is about how Parliament scrutinises, thus legitimises, and how the government exercises statutory powers. But parliamentary scrutiny has been squeezed or compromised by a lack of time and a lack of control over when this business is timetabled. This problem is exacerbated at the end of the session with the unusually high level of legislation we're seeing at the moment. And this problem will be further exacerbated in the future as more powers will be exercised via regulations or more laid documents as required. As more legislation pushes implementing detail into regulations or policy detail onto laid documents, committees will face even greater pressure on their time. The Rural Affairs Committee currently faces this challenge, and we have agreed not to scrutinise 2 laid key documents this autumn, as we don't have time in our work programme. This lack of provision for parliamentary scrutiny and approval risks undermining the fundamental aims and objectives of these policy initiatives, as well as the Parliament's and stakeholders' time given to scrutinise and approve the framework legislation in the first place. I wrote to the Minister for Parliamentary Business in relation to this on the 1st of April, and I would appreciate if he could pick it up in his comments. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Carson. And I now call on Jamie Hepburn, Minister, around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I say I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to respond on behalf of the Scottish Government to this debate. Very much welcome the remarks of the conveners of both Delegated Powers and Law Reform and the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee. The Government has published its response to the committee's report, and I hope it's clear from that response that the Government broadly supports the committee's conclusions and recommendations. I will focus my remarks today on some of the key points in the Government's response, but before I do so, I would first like to acknowledge the way in which the committee approached its inquiry. What I will say is I recognise that this inquiry comes against the backdrop of the issue of framework legislation, having been something being spoken of by a number of members in this parliamentary session. There has been a suggestion from some that so-called framework legislation is a more frequent phenomenon than it previously was. I hear what is said about the 1932 report, and this having been a long-standing issue. I cannot respond on behalf of the Ramsay MacDonald National Government of 1932. I will respond on behalf of this current Scottish Government. What I would respectfully suggest is that whilst it has been asserted that there is a greater frequency with which framework legislation has been brought forward, I have yet to see any evidence in the sense of numbers that would demonstrate that framework legislation, or so-called framework legislation, has been an increased phenomenon. And indeed, I have been an elected representative in this place, indeed for the same length of time as you. I think, Presiding Officer, for 18 years, and I have to earnestly say I have not noticed it as an increased phenomenon in recent years. Of course, I'll give way to Michelle Thompson.
Michelle Thompson.
Minister, for giving way. In some respects, a gentle challenge, does it really matter? Because a lot of the considerations that we are going to cover off today is the efficiency and effectiveness of this type of legislation, and therefore surely we should be equally concerned if there's just a few of them rather than just the number of them. Minister.
Well, I'll come to process, because I think actually the point that has been made by Michelle Thompson actually speaks to the point I making. It is about our processes and how things are scrutinised in this place, and I am always up for discussing how they can be improved, but I'm merely making the point, and this was indeed was referred to by the convener, so I'm responding to a point made by the convener of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. It's been referred to in the report, and it's been referred to in wider discourse in here. There is increased frequency of the use of what is referred to as framework legislation. I'm merely making the response, or responding to that assertion, to say that whilst it's been asserted, I've seen very little evidence that would justify it being held to be the case. But I will turn to the issue that is at hand. I think it's the appropriateness and the manner in which we utilise secondary legislation, making power and the process. But before I come to that, I do want to thank the committee for the work they've undertaken, because it has been an issue that has been discussed in this session. I think it has been a useful exercise for a committee to take away the issue, to look at it in the round, and then to gather that evidence, to have heard from a variety of sources, and then to bring forward a report. So I commend the committee and the clerks who have supported it for that work, and of course the people who went to the committee with their evidence. But then obviously the conversation around the issues raised in the committee report are of course could be felt to be rather arcane or a dry or dusty technicalities around the legislative process. But it is about more in that it speaks to the responsibility which we as a government carry for bringing forward proposals to this place, to Parliament, for Parliament's approval to make good and effective law, and for explaining as clearly as possible, and not just what the immediate impact of any proposed legislation will be, but also the ways in which that legislation might be used in future. I take that responsibility seriously. The Scottish Government takes that responsibility seriously, and it informs how we approach every bill that we take forward. But it is also, I think, important to recognise that we do live in a real world where things will change, and by necessity sometimes it is sensible to take reserved powers so that we can adapt to circumstances quickly. Indeed, I think that was the point that the convener of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee refers to. So it is appropriate for us to take forward legislation which sets out the broad principles, but of course then relies on us to put things into effect through secondary legislation, the payment of benefits, the uprating of benefits, the provision of charges, the registration costs for certain professions. No one would suggest that we come back on a regular basis to set those things by primary legislation. Of course it's sensible we use secondary legislation. Of course I'll give way to Finlay Carson.
Finlay Carson.
I appreciate giving way, Minister. We also appreciate the anger that stakeholders have when the likes of the Good Food Nation, of which my committee took a significant amount of time, pre-legislative, part of the process of putting the bill in place. But actually we don't have time within our parliamentary calendar to look at the plan once it's laid in front of this Parliament. It's actually being dealt with another committee. So there needs to be capacity within the Parliament for us to scrutinise that secondary legislation which underpins the primary legislation that we passed over a year ago.
All through the Chair. Minister.
Well, first of all, Mr Finlay mentioned that he'd written to me. I've had that letter. I have responded to him. I don't know if he's seen my response yet. To be fair, it was only sent this week, but he has had a response from me, so I hope that's felt to be useful. I mean, the issue around capacity for Parliament, this really relates to the point that Mr Kerr makes. The issue around capacity for Parliament to consider a range of matters before it, frankly, for Parliament to consider. Now, Government obviously has a role to play in that respect, insofar as we try and bring forward a manageable caseload of legislation before Parliament, and we seek to do that. Indeed, one of the other things I do is I engage with the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee to tell him how many statutory instruments we'll bring forward. We try and make sure that we do that on a managed basis. But fundamentally, if there is an issue about capacity in Parliament, then woe betide the government to suggest how Parliament should take that forward. And I am aware we have the convener of the Standards Committee who looks as though he's going to contribute to this debate as well. And I know his committee are undertaking an inquiry into committee affecting this. So I'm sure that that will be something that they focus on. But it would not be for government, I think, to dictate or set out to Parliament how it undertakes its work, especially in scrutinising the activities of government. Of course, I'll give way to Mr.
Stephen Kerr.
I understand what the Minister's saying about, here he stands, Minister of the Government in the Scottish Government. I respect that. But as a parliamentarian, I'm sure he must have deep-seated concerns about the capacity of Scotland's Parliament to deal with the issues that have been raised by other members and indeed alluded to by myself. I mean, doesn't the Minister appreciate that because of the unique structures that we have in the Scottish Parliament, that we need to be alert to the issues that might undermine the ability of this Parliament to properly scrutinise what is a very powerful executive?
Minister.
Well, look, of course, I may have a perspective on these matters, but I think it is important to, and he makes the point, I'm standing here as a Minister in the Scottish Government. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to use that platform to set out how Parliament should go about scrutinising the Government. That would be a rather obtuse position for me to be put in, frankly. I would observe, and it relates to a different subject matter, it was the elections bill that we were debating some time ago. Mr Johnson is not here, but Daniel Johnson talked about the appropriateness of the executive taking forward some of the propositions in that bill, and wouldn't it be better for the legislature to do that? And I simply made the point, well, it's in the hands of Parliament to do so. So these are things I would respectfully suggest Parliament is capable of looking at. And again, I go back to the point that the Standards Committee are, of course, looking at these matters. I probably should address the report somewhat, shouldn't I, President Officer? So let me return to that. The committee offers a definition of framework legislation in its report, and indeed there's nothing I find particularly objectionable about its definition. In of itself, it broadly reflects the definition that the government proffered when it was asked what it might feel defined framework legislation. But I am very clear that I think it is rather more important that the focus going forward should not be on whether or not any particular bill is defined as framework legislation, but it should be on the quality of the justification and information provided by the Scottish Government on proposed powers, provided by the Scottish Government to the Scottish Parliament to enable it to undertake that scrutiny role. And of course,
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for taking an intervention, but the benefit of a definition allows much greater agreement before something is presented that it will follow a path that fits for that particular piece of legislation, be it framework or otherwise. Does the Scottish Government not agree that there is a great benefit to having a definition, even though clearly it cannot apply to every legislative vehicle that arrives in this Parliament?
Minister.
I'll be candid. I'm not entirely convinced of that, because with the best will in the world, and I do appreciate the report that has been brought forward, it hasn't really crystallised what a definition would be used for. It hasn't laid out what the actual benefit of a definition might be. I'm not entirely clear that the investment of time and energy on defining whether a bill is a framework bill or not is as important as undertaking the scrutiny and, on our part as a government, the justification of the appropriateness of taking powers in the secondary format, rather than looking at a procedural debate about whether or not they are caught by a definition of framework legislation. Now, I understand, President Officer, you did say we had a lot of leeway, and I've extended quite a lot of it, and I've not got through the report. But what I will say is I'm more than happy to give way if it is possible to do so.
We've not exhausted the generosity, but we're getting closer to it. Stephen Kerr, briefly.
To you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and the Minister for giving way. There is a clear advantage to knowing whether a bill is a framework bill, whether this legislation is setting forth principle rather than the means of delivery of a particular policy. And that is the Parliament can design, adjust the way in which it then scrutinises the secondary legislation that comes from ministers. Because that is the fundamental issue, I think, with framework legislation. It's the ability, particularly of our Parliament here at Holyrood, to be able to properly scrutinise. And I would say to the Minister, and I hope he would take this in the spirit I offer it, because one day perhaps he will sit where some of us are currently sitting, that it's actually in the interests of good government that we get this right. Because a lot of things that happen in this Parliament or produced from this Parliament are unnecessary, unforced errors that would have been caught and corrected if we had a stronger scrutinising approach to secondary legislation.
Minister.
Well, first of all, let me assure Mr Kerr I have no intention of sitting where he is at any time in due course. But I think actually he makes the point I'm trying to make, irrespective of whether or not secondary legislation. Because the question is, are we going to say that any bill with secondary legislation making powers in it is then defined as a framework bill? I don't think we are. I don't think anyone is suggesting that. So the question then would be, well, are we suggesting then that secondary legislation that is taken forward through something that has not been defined as a framework bill should not be subject to the same level of scrutiny as something that has been through a framework bill? Well, Mr Kerr suggests that is the case. I'm less convinced that that is a sensible way forward, because there will be plenty of important matters that we take forward through secondary legislation that wouldn't be through a framework bill, that, frankly, in the interest of good governance, should be just as thoroughly scrutinised. So that's where I stand on the matter. And my position, the government's position, is that we should provide a clear justification at all times for the proposed inclusion of any delegated power we plan to take in a bill. And I would reflect on the fact, and of course our processes should always be subject to reconsideration, to refinement, to improvement. But effectively, that's a system we have now. Every single bill that we take forward, where we say there will be secondary legislation making powers, we have to publish a delegated powers memorandum alongside any bill to justify and make the case for powers to be delegated to the Scottish Government to make and amend law by secondary legislation. And what I will say is, if any individual member or any committee considers what is set out in such a memorandum falls short of expectations, I would expect, frankly, but I would certainly encourage them to raise that with the relevant minister at the earliest opportunity and seek the additional information and justification which they consider to be necessary. And my expectation of ministerial colleagues is that they should be responding in kind and providing as much detail and information as other members require for good scrutiny of our legislative proposals. Let me just respond to some of the specific recommendations in the committee's report. The first being that the committee considers that legislation should, other than in very limited circumstances, set out a high degree of detail on the face of the bill. The Scottish Government agrees with that, Presiding Officer. The committee asks that financial memoranda should include the estimates of costs arising from delegated powers, and the Scottish Government should keep committees updated on the estimated costs arising from a bill. Again, the Scottish Government accepts these points, and indeed, at the request of this Parliament's Finance Committee, I have already ensured that the advice to Scottish Government's bill teams is revised to re-emphasise the need for committees to be kept abreast of changes to estimated costs in financial memoranda. The committee asks that where a Scottish Government proposes the delegation of a broad power, it should consider adding an appropriate super-affirmative procedure to enhance parliamentary scrutiny. The Scottish Government will take this recommendation into account in taking forward its legislative programme. And the committee asks that in relation to Henry VIII powers, and I've not had the chance to say much about Henry VIII powers, I'll maybe try and say a little bit more about that in closing, Presiding Officer, because I can see at now 16.5 minutes of my allocated 7 minutes. I am extending your patience. But
you're redefining the definition of generosity, I think.
You've been very, very generous, Presiding Officer. The committee asked that in relation to such powers, the Scottish Government should consider what more it can do to ensure it consistently sets out such powers' ability to amend primary legislation in a clear and accessible way. The Scottish Government is happy to accept that recommendation. I want to welcome the committee's report. I'm glad that they've undertaken this work. I'm glad that we're having this debate. And of course, the Government will continue to engage constructively with any suggestions for improving the scrutiny of legislation in the Scottish Parliament, whether it comes from the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee or indeed any committee of this Parliament.
Thank you very much, Minister. I now call on Ross McCall. Around 6 minutes, Ms McCall.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's good to stand up. I'm delighted to open this committee debate on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives and to note the report produced by the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee on its inquiry to framework legislation and Henry VIII powers. And on a personal level, I know it's already been said that this is a dry and dusty topic. Well, I actually found the topic extremely interesting. And I want to start off by thanking everyone that took the time to respond for the call to views, who gave up their time to provide evidence to the inquiry. And thanks must also go, as the convener has already stated, to the Clarkson legal team for their support and hard work through this process. Deputy Presiding Officer, the inquiry came about because there's been a steady rise, or shall we say a perception of a steady rise, in utilising secondary legislation as a convenient form of passing laws. It's been suggested that it provides a supposed flexibility to legislation, allowing it to be amended without lengthy process of ensuring every detail is on the face of the bill, makes it more acceptable to societal change and helps with delivery. But that comes with the downside of less scrutiny from the Parliament and a vagueness over the financial memorandum attached. The steady increase, or supposed steady increase, of framework bills was agreed pretty much by most people who gave evidence to the committee. And it certainly was an interesting starting point that we had framework or skeleton legislation, where we were hearing evidence along the lines of, well, we don't know how to define it, but we know it's happening and we don't think it probably should. We have concerns that it produces bad law, but we know it works some of the time. We think framework bills should have a narrow scope, but equally allow for flexibility. And finally, we don't really know how best to change it, but we think it needs changed. And you've got to admit that's an interesting remit at the commencement of an inquiry. And given that that's the starting point, I'm actually delighted with the work that we managed to do as a committee to narrow down into the minutiae and to get to the root of some of the problems that stem from the lack of detail on the face of bills, and the concerns and inability of adequate funding and financial memorandums due to that lack of detail that come forward with some very sensible and achievable recommendations for the Scottish Government. And for me, there's a couple of notable suggestions that I want to highlight. The committee considers that legislation should, other than in very limited circumstances, set out a high degree of detail on the face of the bill. The Minister has mentioned that. And in those very limited circumstances that that approach is taken, it's essential that a full justification at the bill's introduction is given as to why framework provision is appropriate. And all financial memoranda should include an estimate of any costs arising from delegated power provisions, based on how it's expected to or might be used by the administration, and calls on the Scottish Government to ensure it keeps committees updated throughout the legislative process on the estimated cost arising from a bill. And it's on this issue of the financial memorandum that I wish to expand slightly, because this is not only an issue for Finance and Public Administrations Committee, as the convener Kenny Gibson highlighted in his evidence, that framework legislation represents a significant challenge for effective financial scrutiny. But it was also a point that was echoed by Lloyd Austin of the Scottish Environment Link, who spoke about the lack of detail in financial memoranda for framework legislation presenting a scrutiny challenge for stakeholders. So, Deputy Presiding, if we cannot adequately scrutinise the money needed for legislation, we run the risk of passing laws that simply don't have sufficient funds to see the outcomes they're designed for. All the policy decisions and discussions and debate and amendments throughout the legislative process are for naught if there is insufficient funds allocated. And for me, this recommendation from the committee must be sacrosanct. Now, I appreciate that the Minister provided a speedy response to the report. I will take an intervention.
Lorna Slater.
One of the challenges with framework legislation, and I'll bring this in my speech, was things like, for example, the Circular Economy Bill, which we can imagine being in effect for decades. Bills like that can be used to manage things like single-use cups now, or a similar bill was used to manage single-use vapes. How could any committee of Parliament or any, indeed, government minister predict what single-use items might be in use 30 years from now and how much funding might be needed to manage them?
It holds through the chair. Rose McCall.
I thank Lorna Slater for that question. I think it actually highlights a little bit of the concerns there is over framework legislation and how important it is. Because there is a question, absolutely, on how far into the future we're going to have to use our crystal ball to work out financial constraints. But we're not going to be able to break forward proper legislation that we know is going to work and have the outcomes we require if we don't have the right financial memorandum attached. I will.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Rose McCall to give way on that point. Is that not also, interestingly, one of the responses that the Scottish Government has put into this report, that actually Parliament needs to consider when it gives this delegated legislation, whether it should do so or not, and that crystal ball into the future is perhaps an area where you would not give delegated authority?
Rose McCall.
Yeah, I can't really disagree with that statement. Thank you very much to Martin Whitfield for raising it. Now, I appreciate that the Minister provided a speedy response to the report and his recommitment that the Scottish Government will ensure that the Scottish Parliament is provided with sufficient information to understand why a proposed delegated power is considered to be appropriate and proportionate, and how that power is expected to be used, and that is certainly welcome. And again, with regard to the financial memorandum recommendations, I'm pleased to see that the Scottish Government accepts it fully and is working with the Finance and Public Administration Committee on how it will address the financial consequences of bills. So, into conclusion, Presiding Officer, the evidence shows that a definition is difficult, but the report has given a sensible one. Framework bills should be the exception rather than the rule. Flexibility is essential, but thorough communication at inception of a bill is essential. And financial implications should be as detailed as possible and provided up front. With the encouraging letter from the Minister, I look forward to seeing how the recommendations progress to ensure the Scottish Parliament is producing the best laws possible for the people in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Martin Whitfield, again around 6 minutes. Mr. Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, and it is a pleasure to contribute to a debate that I sadly feel probably few are watching, but actually goes to one of the hearts that the challenge has challenged this session in this Parliament. And as others, and genuinely, I thank the committee, the clerks and all of the witnesses that gave evidence so that this report could be drafted, because firstly, I found it a very interesting report. Secondly, I think it's a very important report, and I think the convener does his committee no justice by suggesting this won't be read in 96 years' time when it's looked at again. I deeply hope it will be. Framework bills, Henry VIII powers. We've already had quite a lengthy interaction in relation to the need for a definition, and I, with the greatest respect, disagree with the Minister that a definition is of assistance. Because if there is a definition, then people know what they're looking for. They know when something may have been crafted to avoid that definition. More importantly, they know when something has been crafted that sits in that definition and allows them to approach what is being proposed in a different way. And Henry VIII powers, that secondary legislation, we need to remember goes to areas, as the Minister has already suggested, that could just be increasing the fees or the licence costs of something. But it can also empower ministers to change primary legislation. And that range of power that is given to a government must be given so carefully. There has been a discussion about whether or not this has or has not increased. But I think, interestingly, the name Henry VIII obviously attaches to these powers because it refers to a king who would rather by declaration than by agreement pass legislation. More than happy to.
Minister. I mean, this was actually a point I made at the the evidence session that I undertook with the committee. I wonder if Mr Whitfield would agree with me. Indeed, one of the witnesses that was before, one of the other witnesses before the committee was Andrew Tickell, who talked about the pejorative language sometimes involved. Would he agree with me that the very term, the Henry VIII power, is not entirely helpful because it does sort of somewhat lead into odd conclusions of what a government might do with such a power?
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful for the Minister for that question, and it is interesting because the round table that the First Minister drew together yesterday, the long discussions that we've had in under the guise of electoral law and other about the approach and the language and the use of language. And it's interesting, I think, to pick up on something that Ros McCall put into her speech, and indeed I think the convener mentioned the use of skeleton, headline, enabling. There are a lot of language that is used to describe, and the language that is often chosen depends on where you sit in the argument. And I think this brings me to a really important point, that I think, putting aside party politics, there is a great danger that power corrupts, and that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think governments, and I do not in any way level this accusation against the current Scottish Government yet, that the acquisition of that power can become very comfortable, can become very easy. And I think as we read and are able to access the COVID inquiries that are coming out, we may well see indications of that. And I think one of Parliament's duties is always to hold against that growth of power from the executive. More than happy to give way.
Minister.
I mean, he quotes the age-old maximum, absolute power corrupts absolutely. But, of course, the fact of the matter is we do not, as a government, have absolute power. We are responsive and responsible to this legislature. And, indeed, in relation to the subject matter we debate today, whether or not we accept the notion or the idea or the concept of a framework bill, where the government takes forward a proposal to have the ability to take forward power through secondary legislation, through delegated powers, Parliament has to agree to that. It's Parliament delegating powers to the government. It is in the hands of Parliament to agree or disagree with that proposition.
Martin Whitfield.
And again, I'm grateful for that intervention. And again, it speaks to the intervention that I gave to Ros McCall and indeed to another point previously raised, that at the end of the day, the structures and the procedures that sit within Parliament must be there to support the scrutiny. And it may well be, as the government freely admit, that perhaps the Parliament should, on occasion, say no to the Scottish Government having delegated powers because of insert the good reason at that moment.
Stephen Kerr.
So there was a discussion earlier, Deputy Presiding Officer, about the appropriateness of using Henry VIII, of course an English king. We should make that point very clear. I think the language around that is very appropriate, because shouldn't this Parliament be very jealous of the delegated powers it gives to ministers? Shouldn't it demand a clear line and sight of accounting? And at the moment, does the convener of his particular committee, does he agree that the structures and processes of our Parliament may not be sufficient to be able to manage that delegation appropriately?
Martin.
I'm very grateful for the intervention, and I will use the previous convener's approach to a very similar invite, not with my convener's hat on, I won't. I do want to, and I am conscious of time, Deputy Presiding Officer, there are a number of things that I do want to highlight. That,
Macmillan.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to a point before the interventions when Martin Whitfield spoke about COVID. Now, I think it's fair to say that we as a committee did recognise that COVID was a very unique situation. So clearly our report didn't focus upon that period of time. We spoke about it, we touched upon it, and it did come up in evidence. But we were also very conscious that that was a very different time as compared to kind of normal parliamentary time.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful for that intervention, and absolutely I wholeheartedly agree with the convener with regard to that. And I do want to compliment both the convener and the committee and the clerks for the language they've spoken in about when these powers would be needed and why they would be needed. There is a very clear sensitivity to the fact that there are circumstances where actions have to be taken. But then you have to exercise care that those actions don't, or those powers don't remain going forward. And rightly, I think that the committee chose not to go there, because the questions that you raised and looked at were very important going forward in this session. I'm now desperately conscious of time. What I wanted to do is invite the Minister to articulate and expand on a few interesting responses that the Scottish Government have put to this report, and if you will allow, I will take the recommendation numbering that the Government has done in its response. And the first is when the committee invited the Government to talk about the limited circumstances that a power for a framework bill be used. They very specifically used very limited, a language the Government accepted in a previous recommendation. But interestingly, in its response, it talked about a flexible approach. Again, I wonder whether the Government could actually tie themselves further and agree that it's an incredibly limited circumstance that it should be used. I am now very conscious of... I will talk for a minute or two later to allow a facilitation in those in the chair. And it will allow me to move to two other things that I will do so in short. In particular, the Government seems very resistant to post-legislative scrutiny being used, the concept of sunset clauses, the concept of a reporting clause. The Government pointed out that absolutely these should be acceptable, but then drew attention to the fact that actually it should only be used by committees in a very, very limited way. I think because of the bureaucratic problem of monitoring it going forward, but actually one of the great powers that parliaments around the world are developing is the use of post-legislative scrutiny, not necessarily even within its own parliament, but to be able to continue to hold to account decisions that were made, and when those errors or omissions, or indeed the brilliance of a bill can be highlighted, then it can be used to do that. And again, in summing up, I would wonder whether the Minister was able to articulate a bit more about whether there are concerns with post-legislative scrutiny and also pre-legislative scrutiny. I am consciously aware I am well over time, Deputy Presiding Officer, for which I apologise, and so I will call my comments at the moment to a halt and perhaps pick one or two matters in summing up, which I'll invite the Minister to come in on without notice. My apologies to the Minister. I'm grateful.
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. And I now call Lorna Slater to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Around 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am very glad that this debate has been brought to the Chamber today. Continuous improvement in how we operate as a Parliament is a worthy goal, and I'm pleased to be able to contribute. I have certainly heard, in particular, while I was working on the Circular Economy Bill, from members across the Chamber, their reasonable concerns around framework bills. My position today is largely in support of this mechanism, with the caveat that I recognise and agree with much of what is in the committee's report, although not all of it. There are good reasons why framework legislation might be used, and I'll use the examples in the circular economy space, as that is the area I'm most familiar with. I think every member in the Chamber is aware of some of the problems created by the large number of single-use items that are currently used in our society. We've all participated in beach cleans, seen litter in our parks, and should understand by now, I hope, the carbon impact of manufacturing items which are only used once and then disposed of. Without framework bills, separate primary legislation would have to be brought for every different type of single-use plastic that we want to put in place measures to manage. One can imagine how onerous this would be on parliamentary time and how much less this Parliament would be able to do on health, education, food security, etc., if it was painstakingly passing separate primary legislation for every type of plastic item we want to manage. Certainly.
Philly Carson.
I believe that the issue here is not necessarily about framework bills, it's about the safeguards that accompany the framework bills and the ability for this Parliament to scrutinise that section of legislation when it comes forward. It's incredibly difficult at the moment to do that. Maybe we should look at framework bills with the necessity to have a scrutiny for this approval of this Parliament before the second legislation goes forward. Plans, Good Food Nation plan, for example, will be laid, but there's no role for the Parliament in approving that or amending it in any way.
Lorna Slater.
I'm glad the member raises this point. I will come on to exactly these issues because I agree with the member that improvements in the scrutiny of secondary legislation are indeed possible. To continue on my thought, though, for the moment, I hope that it is obvious that it does make sense to use framework powers to manage things, and that's a particular example. And then through secondary items, through secondary legislation, allowing the Parliament to prioritise those items that are causing the most problems, and also to react quickly to items like single-use vapes that constitute an urgent issue. One of the reasonable issues raised with me during the process for the Circular Economy Bill was the frustration of FPAC Committee that they couldn't adequately scrutinise the framework elements of the bill, because I was unable to tell them how the powers conferred by the bill might be used by future governments, as I mentioned in my intervention with Ros McCall. We can imagine that a bill may have a lifetime of several decades, and who knows what sort of single-use items or novel materials might become problematic in the future. So I think I'll take Michelle Thompson's intervention in a moment. I think there's a good case to be made for a mechanism for financial scrutiny of secondary legislation to mitigate this concern, and I would hope that the Parliament would consider changing processes to allow this.
Michelle Thompson.
Thank you very much for taking my intervention. And yes, I think we sat on opposite sides of that particular bill. I suppose my recollection of the concern at that time is where, from a purely financial perspective, you're presented with a financial memorandum that has hugely vast ranges, considerable complexity, considerable uncertainty, and all FMs are best guesses at the best of times. We accept that. But those sort of circumstances are in place. You're virtually guaranteeing to write a blank cheque. So from a scrutiny and a good governance point of view, it carries significant risks, and it's overcoming that risk. I wonder what she thinks about that.
Lawrence Slater.
No, I absolutely identify with the problem that the member has raised, and that is why there needs to be suitable instruments for managing the scrutiny of the financial costs of things at the secondary legislation stage. So that is a proposal that I'm suggesting to the Parliament that we look at in order to allow that secondary legislation, because absolutely in 20 or 30 years' time, when we're trying to ban some other plastic or manage in some way through a deposit return scheme or some other mechanism, there needs to be adequate scrutiny of that at the time. This Parliament, it would never be able to adequately scrutinise that, but it must be there. But equally, bringing entirely new powers to manage a single item in the future doesn't make sense either. So what I'm suggesting is that we can improve processes around secondary legislation, particularly in the area identified by Michelle Thompson and Finlay Carson, on that financial point. But I would also make another assertion, which is that I am not wholly convinced by arguments that secondary legislation, even negative instruments, can't be adequately scrutinised. And I assert that it can be, should members choose to. And our colleague... Yes.
Jeremy Balfour.
I'm grateful to the member. I think, and she may want to come on and develop this in a moment, one of the problems for opposition is that when you bring forward secondary legislation, you either have to accept it or reject it all. There's no ability to amend. So taking the argument previously said by the member, you might want to bring forward 20 products that you want to ban. The Parliament might say, well, we like 18 of them, but we don't like 2 of them. The Parliament is then left in the impossible situation of having to either say yes or no. And that is the difficulty, which I don't think she's quite yet identified.
Lawrence Slater.
So that particular example is not the example I was coming to, but on that particular example, if we're talking about single-use plastics, you wouldn't be able to bring that many items in one go because they all have to be managed differently and would require different schemes. So that doesn't really apply. But I understand what the member is saying is that it does require yes and no. But the Parliament does have the chance to say no and can use that. Secondary legislation often comes back repeatedly through committees, and you can see that in the Tide Pubs legislation and indeed in the deposit return scheme. That secondary legislation came repeatedly back to committees as it was adjusted and changed. So you don't just get one shot at a secondary legislation. It does get brought back over and over again. So we know that can happen. But actually, if members will allow me to continue, the example I want to give of effective scrutiny of a negative instrument is actually Edward Mountain, who demonstrated this very ably on secondary legislation on deer management, as some of you may recall. He identified that the legislation was coming to committee, not even his committee. He arranged to be at that committee to ask extensive questions of the minister, me in that case. He initiated an effective media campaign to bring the matter to the attention of the public and subsequently forced a short debate in this chamber on the matter. This shows how a member who isn't even on the responsible committee can bring effective scrutiny to secondary legislation when they choose to. And we could all choose to do this more often. We don't have to give the government a free pass on secondary legislation. That's up to our members. Finally, in respect of the committee's report, I am not supportive of the idea of the Parliament having a think again or conditional approval option. It gives opposition parties an easy option that prevents progress without having to take a firm stance on an issue, allowing them to play both sides of the argument with voters. We are all free to vote against legislation, but fence-sitting should not be given additional powers to hold up legislation that has been extensively consulted upon. Part of being an effective politician is being courageous in saying both what you stand for and what you stand against, and politicians should not be able to stand in the way of progress by way of cowardice. And of course, as I have repeatedly said, secondary legislation is often brought back and amended repeatedly, going through the committees and through this chamber several times, as can be seen with the Tide Pubs legislation and the Deposit Return Scheme and others.
Ms Slater is bringing her remarks hopefully to a close now. Thanks.
By its nature, secondary legislation is more flexible and dynamic, and we are called upon as members to keep up and keep on top of the scrutiny role, using Edward Mountain as our role model for this.
Thank you, Ms Slater. We now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 5 minutes. I call Rona Mackay to be followed by Edward Mountain. Ms Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a substitute member of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, I'm pleased to be able to speak in today's important debate. On the face of it, it seems like a dry, somewhat technical subject, but it is in fact hugely important to the integrity of Scotland's democracy and the efficiency of this Parliament. The DPLR Committee's recent inquiry into the framework legislation on Henry VIII powers was an important and necessary piece of work relating to devolved powers in drafting legislation. Framework or skeleton legislation, as we've heard, sets out the principles for new law, but without much of the detail as to how it will be given practical effect. Instead, broad powers to fill in the detail at a later point are given to ministers and occasionally other bodies. Henry VIII powers, which is an unfortunate term in my opinion, allow ministers to amend Acts of Parliament by secondary legislation, which may be minor but very necessary. Presiding Officer, delegated powers are an essential part of the legislative toolkit. The Scottish Government and the Parliament would not be able to function if we relied solely on primary legislation, and that's the reality. During my 9 years in this Parliament and as a member of the Justice Committee for all of that time, this legislation has been used to good effect to update and amend legislation to address changing circumstances and always, in my opinion, used to strengthen that legislation. However, I know that some people consider the use of such powers to be too wide, and so the committee inquiry was keen to explore any safeguards that can be put into place to address these concerns. So the Scottish Government is happy to recommit itself to ensuring that the Scottish Parliament is provided with sufficient information to understand why a proposed delegated power is considered to be appropriate and proportionate, and how that power is expected to be used. And what's more, the committee saw no evidence to suggest that framework legislation is being used more frequently, as the Minister articulated earlier. The evidence that Andrew Tickell gave to the committee talked about pejorative language in the context of framework bills or skeleton bills. In reality, we should remind ourselves that the power is used in fairly straightforward matters. And when it comes to framework bills, the Scottish Government does not set out routinely to introduce them. Bills are always considered on a case-by-case basis, and I think that's a sensible way to legislate. And to be honest, as a Parliament with a small Parliament with thankfully increasing powers, I think we do pretty well. It's also important not to lose sight of the mechanisms and processes that we already have in place in Parliament to scrutinise proposed powers and bills and how they're used. For each and every power in a bill, that memorandum... Yes.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Rona Mackay for being so generous with her time, and it's about that monitoring of the secondary legislation and indeed the previous contribution. The Scottish Government's response is that perhaps committees should take part in the consultation and the development of that Do you think it's appropriate that the body who is going to scrutinise something should take part in the consultation creating that item?
Always do the Chair.
My apologies.
Thank you for your intervention. I mean, I don't see any real problem with that. I think if it's the subject matter should be considered by everybody who's involved in it. So I don't really have a problem with that. For each and every power in a bill, that memorandum must explain the nature of the power, the reason for taking the power and the choice of scrutiny procedure for that power. And as we know, stage 1 of a bill subjects it to careful scrutiny from stakeholders in civic society, and then it passes through stages 2 and 3, with Parliament being held to account at every stage. So in that way, Parliament retains the ultimate authority in determining whether secondary legislation making powers should be in place in any piece of legislation in the first instance. Similarly, when government exercises the powers, including Henry VIII powers to amend primary legislation, Parliament has a key role in scrutinising both the technical and policy elements of the regulations. So ultimately, Parliament does retain the power to determine secondary legislation by either agreeing or disagreeing to it in its affirmative form or determining whether to annul it in negative form. And in a parliamentary democracy, that is, of course, how it should be. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, it's clear to see the rigorous way in which the committee conducted the inquiry and welcomes the overall direction of the government welcomes the overall direction of the report. It's clear that considerable effort has gone into ensuring the committee obtained a wide range of opinion and experience and gaining different perspectives and viewpoints which were represented in this comprehensive report. And I'm very happy to support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Mackay. I now call Edward Mountain, who is joining us remotely, to be followed by Paul O'Kane. Mr Mountain.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to thank the committee and their clerks and all those who gave evidence, because I think it's an excellent report. I'm just nervous now, having been used as a role model by Lorna Slater, that if my career wasn't ending next year, it would have been ended by those remarks. But let's see if we can build on some of the comments that have been made. First of all, Presiding Officer, I think when you're looking at legislation, it's rather like a journey that you do with your family. You work out why you're doing it, where you're going to go, how you're going to get there, what you're going to do when you get there, and what the costs are. Exactly the same in business, Presiding Officer. When you set out to do something, you work out why you're doing it, what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and how you deliver it. That's the same then for legislation. And I don't agree with the Minister for Government Business that there haven't been a proliferation of bills with little detail in them. I believe there have. In the 8 years that I've been a convener in the committee, in the Parliament, I've seen more bills come through with less detail in them. I looked at what in a minute, Mr Hepburn, I looked at some of the names that were given to the bills that were identified by the committee. You know, that they were headline bills, shell bills, enabling bills, framework bills. All those are great names, and they're used to people to promote the bills for what they are. Skeletal bills and jellyfish bills. Mr Hepburn, I'll give way to you.
Minister Jamie Hepburn.
If it reassures Mr Mountain, I won't cite him as a role model any time soon. Hopefully that reassures him. But on his point about the proliferation of framework bills, or indeed the range of pejorative terms he has just used, the issue at hand, though, was the suggestion that there's been a vast increase in the number of such bills. I wonder if he could give me a number. Could he tell me the number there were this session by comparison to last, or indeed the one session before that, or the session before that? Can anyone give an actual number to justify this claim?
Edward Mountain.
Well, that, of course, Mr Hepburn, could be one of the failings of this report, because if you read the report in detail, as I did, that we've seen in the last 7 years in the UK Parliament, the amount of shell bills or skeletal bills have gone up by 3 times in the last 7 years, and it's gone up by 43% in the Welsh Parliament. And what we haven't seen is a figure for the Scottish Parliament, and I think that's one of the failures of this report, and I wish we'd had seen that. Perhaps the committee will have details of that which weren't included in the report. So I have to ask myself, why do we have these bills? And the committee identified that it's a need for flexibility, the ability for co-design, and the lack of policy development in the area when the bills come forward, and the ability to have flexibility, which is something that seems to have come on the back of a lot of the COVID legislation, which was fairly wide-ranging. And my comment to that is, we've seen in the land reform bill that's come forward, a lot of criticism that the committee are being asked to design that bill as it's going through the committee stage. We'll have to see what happens at stage 2. But I think that if you haven't carried out the policy development before you bring the legislation forward to the Parliament, that is a failure in the legislation. And we ask too much of committees who are very heavily committed, especially in the last year of a Parliament, to getting all the legislation through. As I've said, Presiding Officer, I believe that these bills need to be much tighter drafted. I believe that it shows weakness on behalf of governments to argue that they need to co-design a bill or co-design legislation as it's going through the Parliament. That to me shows that there is a lack of detail in the information that they put forward. And frankly, it's bad for parliamentary scrutiny. You have little time, and whereas I'm grateful for Lorna Slater for highlighting the time and trouble that I did to go through the DEAR consultation, it shouldn't have come to that. This should have been discussed long before it came forward to the Parliament. And when it came into the Parliament, I think I was entitled to a 3-minute debate or such to allow that to be discussed. Hardly time for something which I considered so important and I had invested so much time in. I think also when we talk about the legislation and looking at it afterwards, the scrutiny, we talk about the super affirmative procedure. Well, I think we should say the super affirmative procedures, because only the procedure that's laid out in the bill that can be carried out. 60, 90, 120 days. Does it require consultation? Does it require to come back to the Parliament to be approved? Can it be approved by the committee? There is no standard way of doing it, which makes it really difficult and makes it difficult for committees to understand and to get those levels of super affirmative scrutiny detailed out. My belief, Presiding Officer, in closing, I would say my belief is simple, that if we are going to have these skeletal bills, these framework bills, or these jellyfish bills, whatever you want to call them, there should be a mandatory sunset clause in them, and they should allow a super affirmative procedure, which does require it to go back out to consultation to all those that will be affected by it. And we should make it as difficult as possible for the government to introduce those bills so that they go to the detail in the first place. If you get the detail right in the first place, you don't have the problems that we had with the deposit return scheme. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. I now call Paul O'Kane to be followed by Michelle Thompson. Up to 5 minutes, please, Mr O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I am pleased to be able to contribute to this debate this afternoon. And I think it's an important debate because I think it does allow members to express their views and opinions about how we operate in this Parliament and how we pass legislation. And that's perhaps not something we always have the opportunity to pause and to do. And I think that's why today's debate is important. And indeed, I think why the work done by the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has also been so important. And I thank them for the work that they've done in their framework legislation and Henry VIII Powers report. And of course, not only to the convener and members of that committee, but also to all the clerks and all those who have supported all of the work that Stuart McMillan spoke about in his opening. And I know, and we've already heard this afternoon, that many members have experienced frustrations, as I have, over our time in this Parliament, of bringing amendments to bills and attempting to put what we consider to be important details or provisions onto the face of a bill, only to have the response from ministers that they don't consider those issues to be important enough to be put into primary legislation. And as I say, I'll reflect perhaps on areas where this has happened, and we've already heard about, for example, the challenges that were posed in pieces of legislation such as the National Care Service Bill. Yes, I'll give way to the
Minister Jamie Hepburn.
I mean, he would, of course, reflect. I hope the Government is not obliged to agree with him when he brings forward an amendment, and we are perfectly entitled to respond and say we don't think it needs to go in the face of the bill. I go back to the point I made earlier, though. If you can persuade a majority of Parliament, then he'll be successful, the government won't prevail, and his amendment will be part of the primary legislation.
Paul O'Kane.
Typically collegiate approach from the Minister there. I think in a parliament of minorities that we're told about so often, of course the government has a right to bring its legislation. But I think the point is, and all too often in this parliament, Edward Mountain referred to skeleton bills or jellyfish bills, things become Christmas tree bills, because what happens is without setting something out in the face of the bill, we then end up in a situation where we go through various amendments to actually get to the point that could have probably been better established had we had that more collegiate approach that I'm sure the government will take note of in my contribution today. I'll take Michelle Thompson.
Thank you very much. But of course there's no guarantee, even if something is on the face of the bill, that means it's accurate either. I distinctly remember a conversation around the gender recognition reform that if it was put in the face of the bill, this in no way affects the Equalities Act 2010, and I'm not sure how that worked out.
Paul O'Kane.
I will resist the temptation to relitigate the gender recognition reform bill, but Ms Thompson has put it on the record, and I think it's an important broader point about the discussion we're having today and what goes onto the face of the bill or not. And I think it's also a challenge because without things being put onto the face of the bill very often, people that we discuss legislation with, people we consult with, people that we help to draft amendments that they would wish to see in our legislation, as is their right as our constituents, as people who are engaged in public life in Scotland, very often they can say, we are unclear of what the government's intention is within legislation, and we don't know what their thinking is in this area, and it can be hard in even stage one of a bill process to bring that out of ministers and to get that proper debate and discussion and consensus on these issues. So I do think it's not just about me getting my own way and colleagues getting their own way. It's actually something more important, I think, about those sorts of amendments that we seek to bring forward on behalf of, as I say, the people we represent. I mean, I am being very generous with my intervention, so I will give way to the Minister once more.
Briefly, Minister.
I mean, the use of the term, though, it's not about getting our own way, is not particularly helpful. I mean, he suggests, I think, rather superciliously about me being typically collegiate. Actually, the point I was trying to make is that the definition, the breadth of any legislation is in the hands of Parliament collectively. Sometimes the government's position will prevail, sometimes it won't. Indeed, sometimes Mr Kane's position will prevail if you can persuade Parliament that should be the case.
Paul O'Kane.
And I'm pleased that the Minister has given me the opportunity to say that I have successfully amended legislation in this Parliament. But the point, I'm not sure he's listening to the substantive point I'm making about setting things out on the face of the bill to avoid confusion or uncertainty about what the intention is, particularly from the government, as is its right to do so. And I think that's the criticism that has been levelled and has been identified throughout the committee report. So I do think he has to take that on board and take cognizance of that point. Now, of course, I accept the debate that we're having this afternoon has focused perhaps on ministers saying that there's a need for flexibility in legislation, that this debate, I think, is important in highlighting that flexibility is important, of course, but we can't just be seen to be saying that that is an excuse for not taking a more detailed process, as I have outlined, or perhaps queuing policy up to come in at a later date rather than dealing with it in the immediacy of a bill as it is presented before Parliament. And because where there is flexibility and broad power required for legitimate purposes, I would encourage the Government to pay particular attention to paragraphs 264 and 265 regarding the use of super-affirmative procedures and other mechanisms, and I think Edward Mountain made some reference to that in his contribution, not just to provide adequate scrutiny of secondary legislation, but also perhaps to push government to move faster where action has been promised through framework powers to actually ensure
Mr Kane, you
that
will
it
need to bring
can
your remarks to a close,
be delivered. I'm going to now conclude, Presiding Officer, having been generous to other contributions. I thank the Delegated Law Powers and Law Reform Committee once again, and I do hope that the Government will listen to today's debate, because I think it's important that members across the Chamber can express their views about what happens in this Parliament and how we make legislation more robust for the people of Scotland. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr O'Kane. I'm always encourage members indeed to be generous, but I would also point out that in going forward, if a member wishes to accept an intervention, they will need to do it within their allocated time. I call Michelle Thompson to be followed by Stephen Kerr. Ms Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And of course, this is the chance for every participant in this debate to get their own back. Firstly, I would say that I welcome this debate, and I certainly congratulate the DPLR Committee on a detailed, well-evidenced report. And I elected to speak in this report as a member of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. And it is fair to say that our committee has been vexed about the issues arising from a financial perspective in the use of what I'll term framework bills. We know that public sector expenditure is considerably constrained, and I won't labour the reasons for that in this speech, but just note that surely that must mean that there's an imperative for as much efficiency and effectiveness in public spend. We cannot be wasting public money. And I would have to say that based on my experience thus far, if we applied that test to some of the financial memorandums for framework bills, then they have fallen short. Now, the report noted that, and I quote, the FPA committee suggested that co-design processes to finalise exact policy during and beyond the passage of the relevant primary legislation presented significant challenges for effective financial scrutiny. I think that's an understatement. And Kenneth Gibson, MSP, who I know regrets he can't be here today, but noted, although we're not particularly keen on them if the framework bills are to be used, all the co-design work and stakeholder engagement should be done prior to the bills coming to the committee so that we could fully analyse the costs. And I'm interested in the Minister's view in his summing up as to the extent to which this can be done, and if not, why not. Now, our committee has also made commentary about the quality of some of the financial memorandums for framework bills. And I'll take the same approach as Stuart McMillan and not name them, for that's not the point. But it is fair to say that we felt that they were below par for our job of scrutinising FMs. And I think I might have remarked somewhat tartly in one committee that if this was your money, would you be committing that as a way of kind of giving effect to that? Yes, happily. Minister.
I mean, she says she won't name the specific bills, and I understand why, because it's obviously an issue in the round. But would she accept actually that has been a good example of the scrutiny process itself, because the Finance Committee wrote to the Government asking us to improve and refine our process in relation to financial memoranda, the quality of them, and that's what we've done. So again, that shows Parliament holding Government to account.
Michelle Thompson.
Yes, I completely agree. And actually, in my remarks further on, I was going to accord and give the respect to the Scottish Government for responding to the Finance and Public Administration Committee in addressing our concerns. So I absolutely happily agree with that. Speaking as someone with considerable business experience in assessing business cases, estimate of costs for larger programmes and so on, I have been concerned when we look at it from a purely technical basis. We know that FMs include educated guesses, but the point I made earlier to Lorna Slater, range is an important function of how tight the scoping, the policy is, and generally speaking, if you've got a massive range of costs from X to Y, that is telling me something about how tightly scoped the policy work has been, and that for me brought out a concern, because I think, going back to my point about efficiency and effectiveness, if under challenge in front of the committee the member or the minister is able to clearly articulate the basis of every measure, that gives us confidence. And actually, again, I would also say, in fairness to all the ministers and members, where they've not been able to do that, that is absolutely illustrating my concern. And of course, the point has been made by a number of people that even good scrutiny up front, we do have an issue over around secondary legislation when we look at it from a purely financial spend lens against a backdrop of shortage of public sector money. One key point, I don't know it's come out enough, when we talk about post-legislative scrutiny, and especially from a financial perspective, how on earth are we meant to be able to do that when we're using a framework bill with absolutely massive ranges and considerable uncertainty, considerable complexity? I don't see how it can be done. We need to own up and be quite aware of that fact. I'm going to finish quite quickly because I've made a lot of my points as I've been intervening on everybody, but I think the committee points about powers allowing flexibility just in case, unlikely to meet the test for the necessity of the power, completely agree with that. Consultation and co-design in a bill's provisions up front, completely agree with that. And the last comment, as a general rule, a lack of policy development is not an appropriate justification for introducing framework legislation. Now, I suspect the Minister, if I wasn't running out of time, would want to intervene on that. I'm not saying they're doing that, but what I'm saying is there's a potential for that possibility to occur, and we need to be alive to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Thompson. I now call Stephen Kerr to be followed by Michael Maher. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I've also made a number of contributions, maybe quite lengthy contributions, and therefore I would wish to be circumspect in respect of the time I have. But I do want to thank Stuart McMillan and his committee for producing what I do think is an excellent report. And I think there have been a number of really good contributions in this debate, including, if I may say so, specifically Michelle Thompson's that we've just listened to, and my colleague Edward Mountains, who I think actually gave a model class, an excellent class on what the shortcomings of the current setup is. But we are considering a matter of huge constitutional significance, and it ought to concern every one of us as parliamentarians, because what we're talking about is the shifting balance of power between Parliament, this Parliament, and the Executive. And I know the Minister has been at times a little, I think, too thin-skinned about this, but I think most of us think on the basis of the evidence of our own experience that there has been a growing tendency towards framework legislation, bills that set out broad principles but leave ministers to fill in the details through secondary legislation later. I'm going to make some progress because I think I can predict what you're going to say. OK, if you'll be very tight.
Minister?
I'm always kind to Mr Kerr, of course. I think uncharitably describing as thin-skinned, I wouldn't say I was thin-skinned. I am frustrated, though, because yet again it's being asserted that there's an increase in the number of these bills, but no evidence presented. How many? Give me some numbers.
Stephen Kerr?
Highlighted that perhaps that was one aspect of the report that was missing, the actual number. But I think the evidence of our experience in this session is absolutely clear that there has been an increase. And I think, frankly, that the report highlights this fact in the sense that these framework bills are no longer the exception. They're increasingly the norm. And look, I didn't want to argue with anything that Lorna Slater said about the importance. She's not in her place, but I wouldn't have objected to anything she had to say about the place that framework legislation has. But I think Edward Mountain absolutely summed it up when he talked about the important safeguards that need to be put in place when there is a framework bill. And we've got to be careful it doesn't become our standard approach to legislating, which I think is what we're concerned about. And as parliamentarians, we ought to have that concern. We ought to be jealous about the power of this Parliament as delegated to ministers. We ought to be extremely careful and attentive to the way that ministers use the powers that are granted to them through legislation. And at the end of the day, we're talking about the scrutiny of Parliament on a powerful executive. When we talk about this Parliament being the most powerful devolved Parliament in the world, we're actually talking about the Scottish Government, probably one of the most powerful devolved governments anywhere in the world. And the truth is, I think the bottom line is that our structures for scrutinising secondary legislation are simply not strong enough. I will give way to Michelle Thompson.
Michelle Thompson?
With respect, I'll be very quick. Just to point out my recent trip to Atlanta to the Legislative Assembly, in my meeting with the Minister for Economy there, he pointed out all oil and tax take accrues to their bottom line and they have unlimited warning powers. So in terms of the strongest Parliament in the history of humanity, that's not true.
Stephen Kerr.
Said it's the strongest in the history of humanity. I think I've made it clear it's one of the strongest, most powerful in the world, and I think that stands scrutiny. I just don't think our Parliament's design is adequate. I think the way we do things in respect to secondary legislation has been shown time and time again in this debate by colleagues who have brought vast wealth of experience of time spent in this Parliament. We have to look at the unique aspects of our Parliament and how that is limiting the ability of this Parliament to hold the Executive to account and to properly scrutinise their actions. We cannot get into the game of acquiescence. I did not agree, I'm sorry, but I did not agree that COVID should be seen as an exception. It's in that moment of the most severe test of a parliamentary system that the Parliament has to assert its authority, not give it away. That, to me, is acquiescence, as I said a moment ago. So I share the view, strongly held by many who gave evidence to the committee, that when secondary legislation stems from framework acts, our procedures must be up to the task. And that's why I think it is important, and we seem to all agree on this, that when you know one when you see one, is what I think was the consensus view. And I think Stuart McMillan just about said those words. The reality is, if it is the judgment of the Parliament that this is a framework bill, then the way that it is set up in terms of post-legislative scrutiny, in terms of secondary legislative scrutiny, needs to be different. We need to talk about what we really mean.
Mr Kerr is concluding his remarks.
Super-affirmative procedures, pre-laying scrutiny, mechanisms that empower the Parliament and don't allow the government to take advantage of the perceived weakness of the design of the processes in order to impose the will of the Executive. Now, these ideas I don't think are very radical. And,
Mr Kerr, you will need to conclude, please.
In respect, and I will conclude now, in respect to members of the government party, I do mean this. One day you will not be the government. And you need to put yourself in the position of yourselves as parliamentarians first, occasionally, so that you can see that the best interest of good governance and the future of our country is best served by modernising the procedures of this Parliament.
And we now have Michael Mara, up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll start where Mr Kerr ended. There are emergency circumstances, I believe, in which government should be able to process laws and regulations that impact citizens without the standard parliamentary scrutiny. Because at all those other times, Parliament judiciously exercises what is a time-limited power granted to us by the citizenry. But I do stress the word emergency. The COVID emergency was that most recent example, and it's I think some of us fear that the tendency that was given through government at that point has continued into this parliamentary session. If I can make some progress, Mr Kerr, I'm afraid. But when extending the powers of government, the issue lies not with how you might perceive the current government to be using those powers, but how any future government might use them, and the question that I think Mr Kerr just put to colleagues in the government in that regard. The SNP are asking us to assume that every government will always be acting with good faith. I would say that such an assumption is at best naive, and the potential for future governments of any stripe to misuse powers should be in itself be the reason to have the highest level of safeguards. History, and of course increasingly the present day, are replete with warnings against the removal of legislative standards and breaches of long-standing political norms. Indeed, the First Minister has spent the entirety of the last week talking to the country as much as he possibly can about the possible threats in that regard. He hosted a taxpayer-funded meeting in Glasgow yesterday, warning against the rise of anti-democratic forces in Scotland. So we should take him at his word in that regard, certainly.
I'm grateful to him, Governor. We'll be very brief. The problem with the COVID situation is that the government still have all of those emergency powers with no sunset clauses whatsoever.
Indeed.
I certainly take that point on board, and I think that's part of the reason, in my view, why this is an important report that we're seeing today. But as Deputy Convener of the Parliament's Finance Committee, I have witnessed many of the issues with legislation that's been brought forward by the Government in this session, particularly in relation to financial memorandums. On the 23rd of January 2024, it was a civil servant who, much to the embarrassment of ministers, told our committee that the cost envelope for the National Care Service Framework Bill was not the £1.2 billion set out in that financial memorandum originally, but was, in fact, upon revision, an eye-watering and mind-boggling £3.9 billion. And the previous Minister, Kevin Stewart, MSP, on the 8th of November 2022, had come to committee and quibbled with a COSLA estimate of £1.5 billion, apparently entirely unaware that actually the real cost was nearly 3 times that. The nature of that bill, so legislation first, any policy detail at all to be included much later, if at all, had made it effectively impossible to cost the bill for the civil servants that were provided with it. Thank goodness it was the Finance Committee, prior to my involvement in it, that had rejected the original estimates as being incompetent. They were certainly proven to be so in the subsequent evidence that was received by committee. Had committee not actually rejected that original financial memorandum, Parliament risked passing a bill that would have left the taxpayer on the hook for nearly £4 billion. So I would gently say to the Minister, I know that he is particularly keen to make this point about the number of bills, but take one bill and the £4 billion cost that would have resulted from it for the taxpayer. And I think that's a good reason enough to look at this very, very carefully. The National Care Service saga is one illustration of the fact this government has no grip on the finances within its legislation. There are many more. The National Care Service Bill itself, the Children Care and Justice Bill, the Circular Economy Bill, the Police Ethics, Conduct and Scrutiny Bill, the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill. And the issues that have been raised through the scrutiny of those financial memorandums have been laid out by my colleague Michelle Thompson in part, and also the contents of the letter that was sent to the Minister. And the Minister rightly responded that the Government accepted the recommendations that were in that, and regarding the technical means by which some of these areas could be judged. I would highlight to the Minister that there remains issues about the standard procedures about when a revised financial memorandum might be provided to Parliament, at what stage, whether that be before stage 2, after stage 2, and clarity for civil servants in that, I think, is absolutely critical. But in our submission to this inquiry, the Finance Committee also raised this issue of co-design. Pass the law, then decide what it might, could or should mean later. It's a recipe for an unholy mess. In my view, this tendency is politics first and headlines at all cost. What you do when the thinking has not been done, but you need to say something about some policy area that has to be progressed. Nobody has ever been able to explain to us why you cannot co-design before you legislate and know what you're legislating for. I'm afraid I'm running out of time, Michelle Thompson, otherwise I would gladly give way. Presiding Officer, government attempts to bypass Parliament are both an issue of democratic principle, but they are a key issue of financial responsibility. In the last 3 years, we've had 3 emergency budgets in this Parliament with massive in-year cuts, up to £1 billion, an emerging fiscal gap in the billions, with apparently no plan whatsoever from the government to get a grip of it. The social security budget overcommitted in this financial year alone to £1.3 billion. This week, Mary Spowage of the Fraser-Allender Institute told Finance Committee the government's last few budgets have been, I quote, chaotic. This chaos is down to decisions taken by the government. It means by which this government's legislative agenda impacts on the growing financial chaos is, or should be, entirely in control of Parliament. And we must ensure that responsibility is defended and upheld in the face of a government that's entirely lost control of the public's money.
Thank you, Mr Mara. We now move to closing speeches. I would ask members to stick to the speaking time that they've actually signed up to and agreed to. With that, I call Lawrence Slater to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I've really enjoyed this debate today, joining Ros McCall and Martin Whitfield and others as in self-identifying as a bit of a process nerd. I note concerns by members of this chamber and elsewhere of the perceived increase in framework legislation, and I note that there are similar concerns that the number of framework bills have also been increasing at Westminster, with both the Conservative government and the Labour government finding these types of bills useful. My impression is that governments, both in Scotland and elsewhere, are becoming more ambitious. Governments are being expected by voters to do more and are becoming more interventionist, something I support, as we have collective challenges facing us in climate and nature emergencies and other chronic things like child poverty, which will require significant and increasing government interventions. However, the number of Parliament sitting days and parliamentarians is not increasing proportionately to the work to be done. And something has to give if we are to be able to make timely interventions using legislation. And indeed, if we are going to be able to react as a nation to the complex challenges ahead of us. One of the fears that I often hear voiced by opposition parties about framework bills is that they don't know what the government might do with them. This has always seemed like a bit of an admission of a lack of ambition on their part to me. If they seriously imagine themselves ever being parties of government, they might have a good... Sorry, I need to stick to time this time. They might have a good think about how they would use the powers of such legislation should they ever become a party of government. Of course, it's a worry to any of us that framework legislation may be used in subsequent parliamentary terms to do things we might not agree with, even undoing work that we have supported. But such is the nature of the democratic process. On the so-called Henry VIII powers, Certainly, there are concerns in the environmental spaces that the so-called Henry VIII powers in the Natural Environment Bill could be used to roll back environmental protections, although other members may have the opposite concern that they might be used to overrule the concerns of a different set of stakeholders for the purposes of nature restoration or protection. In either case, I'm not sure that the government is being entirely transparent about their intentions, and a future government may use these powers with substantially different intentions, which does concern me. I'm disappointed by Edward Mountain's disdain for co-design, something that I understand has led to better outcomes for Scottish farmers in agriculture reform than their colleagues down in England. Yes, certainly.
Jeremy Balfour.
Quickly.
Yeah, very briefly. I don't think Mr Mountain is against co-design. What he's asking is, why can't the co-design take place before the bill is brought to Parliament, so Parliament can vote, rather than doing the co-design afterwards when there's no democratic scrutiny behind that?
Lawrence Slater.
I understand the question, and Michael Maher raised the same point. I guess the challenge is, how do you co-design something when you don't know what powers you have yet? And some of that is challenging, setting out that process. So this is one approach. The process that the member suggests, where you do it all in one go, would definitely be more challenging to do in terms of getting the timing down and getting it right. The process of taking the powers and then agreeing with the stakeholders who are going to be affected does seem to me to be a sensible one, because gone are the days when parliaments can be ivory towers imposing powers through primary legislation that are difficult to change. Just very quickly.
Briefly, Stuart Miller.
I thank Lorna Slater for taking intervention, just for the Chamber's record, and also for Lorna Slater, that Johnny Hall from the NFU Scotland, when he gave evidence to the committee, I would recommend actually everyone to have some regard to what he actually said with regards to co-design.
Lawrence Slater.
Thank you very much. As an example, I'm continuing my point on imposing powers by primary legislation that can be difficult to change in these fast-moving times. And as an example, I will note the primary legislation covering Holyrood Park, which was created in the 1970s. We're now in the absurd position that we can't even charge for parking or make basic changes to improve access and accessibility in the park without changing primary legislation. Primary legislation that contains too much detail can lack flexibilities in ways that does hurt communities, and getting time in a crowded parliamentary schedule to change such primary legislation is really difficult. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I would welcome new processes to allow this Parliament to scrutinise secondary legislation and to undertake effective post-legislative scrutiny on it, especially to resolve concerns around finances. But I welcome framework legislation as a useful tool in some circumstances to allow this Parliament to react effectively to a changing world.
Thank you, Ms Slater. I call on Martin Whitfield to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 5 minutes, please. I'm
very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer. And just to return to the point that Lorna Slater has just raised about co-design and the period of time that it happens in, I think one of the interesting challenges that comes about in this, particularly in this session, is the very changing nature of bills as they go through the passage of scrutiny in this Parliament. And it is perhaps that something that should be looked at, about deciding what it is that you want to legislate, as articulated by Edward Mountain, how you intend to get there, then draft it, and then put it forward to the scrutiny. Because it's on that scrutiny point that I want to spend a couple of minutes. And I raised with Rona Mackay one of the responses that the government has put in respect to the recommendations from the committee, and that is the suggestion from the government that committees of this Parliament should take part in the consultation in respect of both bills but also secondary legislation. This is from a government that rightly distances itself as a government from influencing and being involved in parliamentary change and amendment. I absolutely respect that. And I'd be interested to hear the Minister's views on why a scrutiny committee charged with holding the government to account, charged with adding suggestions, influences, ideas and opinions to a piece of drafted legislation, should participate in either that co-design or the consultation earlier on, and whether or not involvement in that consultation could actually prejudice proper scrutiny going forward. There are a number of other matters which appear in the government's response, and I do welcome the significant acceptance by the government of a lot of this report. And I think it is to be welcomed that. And I know from changes that have already happened, the number of contributions regarding financial memoranda, that the government itself has changed, in essence, the instructions that should go with that. And I would hope, even in the relatively short period of time that we have left in this session, although one that I think, as Finlay Carson pointed out, may have a level of legislative scrutiny that we haven't yet expected, that we see the benefit of those better and more meaningful financial memoranda. And it is, I think, again, to pick up Lorna Slater, although I'm in disagreement with some of the way that she articulated the need for framework legislation. It is in relation to scrutiny of the subsequent secondary legislation, and I'll use that language carefully, the secondary and subsequent legislation, that we should look. I think there is a need for an improvement in the process, particularly where we have identified framework legislation, particularly in areas where post-legislative scrutiny, including sunset clauses, including... I'm happy to give way if it's brief, Mr Carson.
I very much appreciate you giving away. I think one of the key issues is the lack of clarity in primary legislation over the coordination of the secondary legislation and other lead documents coming forward. And we heard, as part of the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill, a former NFU chairman suggesting co-design was a fig leaf for doing nothing. And that's exactly what we're seeing with regards to that bill.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful for that intervention, and indeed that speaks to the requirement for the need for scrutiny, which goes back to where I began, about a definition of framework legislation and whether indeed we need to identify framework legislation so that we can put in place different approaches to how that scrutiny takes place, be it in the weeks, months, years or even decades after. Although I do go back and strongly support the government's response that we should very, very carefully consider when we devolve powers to the Scottish Executive to bring legislation further down the line. I think there have been a significant number of very good contributions, far too many to go into, and I think it speaks again actually to the importance, to the value of this inquiry that the committee have undertaken. I note that one of the recommendations from the government is for the committee to consider whether or not guidance is produced, and it would be interesting to see in due course where the committee decide to take that. So in conclusion, I think it's been a very interesting, a very beneficial debate, but one that is perhaps only the start of where we need to go, perhaps in this session for future sessions, to provide better, more high quality, more timely scrutiny of both framework legislation, for which I think we have a definition, but more importantly, the legislation that comes under it. I'm grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. I now call on Jeremy Balfour to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking my fellow committee members and the clerks and all those that gave evidence to the committee. It has been a really interesting process. I have to confess, this afternoon has not gone quite where I had expected it to go. At some points it felt like I was 40 years back at first-year law, having some kind of jurisdiction great debate. And at other times I was thinking, I'm glad I'm not part of Edward Mountain's family. His holidays seem to be a bit like a military operation, but not much fun. However, I think it has been a really helpful debate, and I would just like to reflect briefly on a few remarks. I'm not going to take an intervention from a minister before he jumps up. I do think all the evidence across almost every jurisdiction in the Western world is that we are seeing more framework bills coming forward. Not just in this Parliament, but at Westminster and in Northern Ireland and in Cardiff and in other parts of Western Europe. And I think, as much as he wants numbers and figures, I think it just is a reality. And one of the reasons for that, and it's interesting, was picked up by Lorna Slater, is that we do live in a very different society than 30, 40 years ago. We have 24-hour news. There is an expectation that people respond quicker. But I'm not sure that is a justification for going down the road that we have gone. The framework bills I do have a concern about, and I absolutely agree with Michael McMahon in his remarks about them in his speech. I am not against consultation and involving stakeholders in legislation. In fact, I think we should do more of that. But where we go wrong is to do that consultation after we pass the legislation. And I do think it is a bit of laziness, and it's a wee bit not wanting to be held accountable by this Parliament, but that's why it happens. And so I would much prefer to see the government do the consultation, get all the ducks lined up, and then bring forward a bill which Parliament can properly scrutinise and then can properly decide what they want to amend and what they want to take forward. That would, I think, give a lot more assurance in regard to the financial memorandum, as picked up by Ros McCaw and by others, and would also allow Parliament to make the choice rather than the legislature. I want to concentrate most of my remarks around secondary legislation and the inability of Parliament to be able to amend those regulations that come before us. I do think it's something that probably the next Parliament needs to come back and look at again, and picking up remarks by the previous speaker. This is perhaps the start of a journey rather than the end of it today. Because if we take the Social Security Bill, which went through this Parliament a number of years ago, we all made that decision. I've reflected on it over the last few days. We made the decision that the criteria for who would get benefit would be done by regulation, rather than having it in the primary legislation as it is at Westminster. And that was to give flexibility, it was to give consultation, it was to give the usual remarks that we get from government. But the problem with that now is that if any changes want to be made in regard to who can get disability benefit here in Scotland, as a Parliament we have to take them all, or we have to reject them all. There is no way of any opposition or any even government MSP being able to amend those regulations. Now, I absolutely accept, and the evidence we took was that it would not be an easy process to design to allow some form of amendment to regulation. But it is possible to do. It would have to be done not in every circumstance. It would have to be quite a high threshold for that to happen. But I do think it is worth a committee of this Parliament looking at whether we can go forward to allow members to amend secondary legislation rather than just having this yes-no, very negative decision. And I would welcome further discussions around that. I think what is clear, and again I say this with due respect to the Minister, is that governments are always going to love secondary legislation. We're always going to love bills that have little detail in them, because it means they're not held to account. And on the reverse of that, those of us in opposition don't like them and are never going to like skeleton bills. And that is just the reality of life. But there must be at some point that we can come together and seek a way forward for the goodness of this Parliament, for the sake of Scotland, and the legislation we pass.
Very briefly, Ms Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Jeremy Balfour for giving way. The super-affirmative procedure, by the very words of the Scottish Government's own handbook, is a bolt-on measure that allows additional powers. Maybe through that we could invite the Government to allow amendable secondary legislation that uses the super-affirmative procedure to see if it works.
Jeremy Balfour.
Yeah, I think that is one possibility amongst others, and I think it would probably take greater minds than certainly I to come up with a designation, but I do think it's something that's worth looking at. I want to thank all the members for this debate this afternoon. I think it has been interesting, and I do hope that whoever forms the next government in a year's time will not just simply forget about this report for another 60 years, but will look at some of its recommendations and take it forward. I think for the sake of this Parliament and for Scotland. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Balfour. I now call on Minister Jamie Hepburn to close on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Well, in relation to Jeremy Balfour's last remark, I'm quite sure it will be the SNP that will form the next government after the election. But in relation to today's debate, I am glad that we have had it ordinarily at the outset when we're told we have some time in hand that gives a certain indication that a debate is vastly undersubscribed, and I, or indeed if I fail to turn up, Mr Whitfield or another member of the Bureau might be asked to move a motion to bring forward decision time. It appears we have avoided that, which does give some indication that there has been great interest in Parliament in this matter. So I congratulate the committee on drafting a report that has captured Parliament's imagination, as well it should, because these are important matters. And I can give an assurance to Mr O'Kane. I will certainly take on board everything that has been said over the course of today's debate. I won't necessarily agree with all of it, but of course I will reflect on it. And I've already made the point that I very much welcome the report, and hopefully people can see that's reflected in the manner in which the Government has responded. I do want to turn again to the matter of what has been claimed around the volume of framework bills. I've still yet to hear any empirical evidence that would suggest that it is the case that we are seeing a substantial increase or more framework legislation now than in previous sessions. And I say to Jeremy Balfour, he was rather dismissive of the notion that I would request such evidence. I think it is kind of important, if someone's going to make a claim, that they can stand up and justify it. And I saw Mr Mountain lay out some figures that relate to the UK Parliament, as members in this place are all too want to point out. Indeed, Mr Kerr is very often pointing this out, that this is the Scottish Parliament and not the UK Parliament. So it may be the case in other jurisdictions. I cannot speak to that, but I have, in my 18 years, not particularly felt that there's been a substantial increase in the amount of what we are seeming to define as framework legislation. Of course, I'll give way to Mr
Michael Mara.
The Minister given way. What do you say to the point that I made to him, that if you can set that number aside for the moment, take the number of £2.7 billion, the underestimation within the framework bill for the National Care Service, due to the fact that it was completely uncostable? Is that not a significant risk that this Parliament should be guarding against by revising the procedures and having a reduction in the number of framework bills on that bill alone?
Minister.
Well, actually, I was going to come to Mr Mara's point, because actually I think he makes the point about our procedures being effective. That is the epitome of parliamentary scrutiny. It went to the committee scrutinised it, and it raised its concerns about financial memorandum. And I don't think I need to rehearse the history of where we've reached with that particular piece of legislation. I think I won't, Mr Mara, because I did have to give way a number of times in my opening remarks, and I think I went to about 16.5 minutes, and I only have 4 minutes left, and I do want to respond to the debate. And again, I would make the point, I think it is rather more important we focus on our process, and I think most people have actually laid that out, rather than, by contrast, obsessing over what is or what is not a framework bill. And I am absolutely happy to engage with Parliament on how we might consider refining our process. But let's reflect on where they are just now in relation to any bill where the Government seeks to ask Parliament to delegate its authority to take forward and exercise powers. We must lay a delegated powers memorandum. We must seek to justify that request, and it is incumbent on Parliament to agree or disagree whether or not that should be the case. The power remains in the hands of Parliament. Parliament can reject or agree to that proposition. And indeed, and this is where I disagree with Jeremy Balfour, that the utilisation of secondary legislation doesn't allow for scrutiny. In the exercise of those powers, where they've been granted by Parliament, there is a delegated powers and law reform committee that he sits on, so he should be aware of that, hopefully, and subject committees where they can scrutinise any instruments they are interested in and hold ministers to account for them. The Scottish Parliament can also reject or annul instruments and require the Scottish Government to think again, which is not a feature, I should say, in every parliamentary system. So I do not necessarily agree with what has been articulated, that the balance between the executive and the legislature in this place is disproportionate. I'll give way.
Jeremy Balfour.
Again, without pushing my point, but the Minister would recognise that it is just simply yes or no that the Parliament can vote on. There is no way that we can say we like most of it, but not all of it.
Minister.
Well, I recognise that, but ultimately that then has to be a decision for the Committee of Parliament to take in the round. And if ultimately that's part of the reason that a Committee of Parliament rejects what is laid before it, then that's something that the government has to reflect on. And indeed, there's been a number of occasions where we've not even gone to vote because the committee has raised such concerns and the government's gone away and thought again. I want to also talk about the appropriateness of the approach we take with secondary legislation. Lorna Slater made the point in relation to the circular economy as being a very appropriate example of where it makes sense to use secondary legislation. There are multiple examples where we look at the rate of benefits, where we might be considering some form of charges, where we might be considering some form of registration fees, where we might be considering some form of payments, as Mr Carson's committee regularly has to do. So these might change on an annual or, at the very least, a regular basis. Are we serious to suggesting we bring that back for primary legislation on each and every instance? I don't think that would be an appropriate use of our time. Let me conclude, because I didn't get to speak about Henry VIII powers previously, but I do want to focus on that. I do think it is a pejorative terminology, which I don't think is helpful. Mr Kerr made the remark that it's appropriate because it's named after an English monarch and it pertains to Westminster. That's an interesting, perhaps unintentional recognition of the nature of Westminster, I might suggest. I think I have very little time to give way, President Officer. I have very little time, Minister. I have very little time, so I'm afraid I'm unable to do so. I would, though, suggest that the terminology is unhelpful, and if there is some concern about defining these things as we are seeking to define a framework bill, then perhaps we could look at a better definition for such a power. But what I would say is that where such powers are put in place in a bill, again, that has to be agreed to by Parliament. Power fundamentally remains in the hands of Parliament, and they are not used for major matters. Invariably, they relate to small things such as lists of organisations that might have been prescribed in the face of primary legislation that had to, for example, be statutory consultees. Some of those organisations may no longer exist. Are we seriously suggesting that we bring forward primary legislation to
Minister
change,
is now concluding.
Again, let me apologise. I would have genuinely been happy to give way to Mr Kerr and Mr Carson, but time is running out, by assuring Parliament, assuring the committee that we welcome the report. We will, of course, continue to respond to any concerns that Parliament has about proposed delegated powers, and of course will take forward the commitments we have made in response to the committee's report.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Bill Kidd to wind up on behalf of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, and if Mr Kidd could take us to decision time at 5 o'clock, that would be most helpful.
Right, thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to say thank you to our excellent DPLR clerking team and to the legal team. And thanks to everyone who's taken part in what's been a really thoughtful and engaging debate this afternoon. Pardon me, but one thing I must say is I'm going to save everyone's thigh and buttock muscles because I'm not taking any interventions, so don't even try. I'd like to, though, begin by thanking the Minister for Parliamentary Business for his response to the committee's report, and also to the Scottish Government for the constructive and collaborative way in which they've approached this with the committee. There's clearly a lot of common ground, which is always a good place to be starting from. This afternoon's discussions have been really interesting, and I do hope that the committee's report will prove useful for colleagues across and out with the Chamber as we continue to scrutinise legislation, particularly when it comes to the increasing use of framework powers. We've been listening closely to what's been said here today, and we'll be taking that away with us, reflecting on how we can continue to support the Parliament in its role, not just at the point when a bill comes in, but throughout the life cycle of legislation, including subordinate legislation made under those broader powers. One of the key points in the report is that we are seeing more framework legislation, as has been mentioned, than we did even a number of years ago, and in fact this trend seems to be picking up pace. As we've set out, framework legislation is where the bill sets out the broad principles, but leaves a lot of the detail to be filled in later by ministers or by others. Now, there can be a case for that approach in very limited circumstances. Flexibility is what's important, and we all understand that. What the committee is saying is that, as a general rule, legislation should set out as much detail as possible up front so that parliamentarians, stakeholders and the public can see clearly what's being proposed and engage with it properly. That's about openness and accountability. And where a framework approach is used, we believe it's essential to provide a clear justification right at the start about why that's necessary in a particular context of a bill. Now, some really good points have been made today around the idea that just-in-case powers, those that are included simply for flexibility down the line, probably don't meet the test of necessity. That's something we should all actually reflect on. The committee has also highlighted the importance of consultation and co-design before a bill is introduced. If a policy isn't fully developed, that's not a reason to default to broad enabling powers. We should be aiming for detail, not deferring it. We've also looked at how scrutiny can be improved, not just of primary legislation, but of the regulations and other instruments that follow on from it. That includes recommending that broad powers be backed up by proper justification in the Delegated Powers Memorandum. And where these are concerns, committees might look at adding reporting or review provisions into bills so that we as a parliament can keep track of how those powers are being used. Now, when it comes to subordinate legislation, we know how frustrating it can be that we can't amend it. That's a real concern, especially with significant regulations made under framework powers, and that's why we are suggesting that further work might be needed to explore whether some sort of think again power could help address those concerns. That's something we'll be flagging in our legacy report. Now, on the so-called Henry VIII powers specifically, the committee's general content with how we have seen these drafted in Scottish Government bills, and we are satisfied that the parliamentary procedures around them are appropriate. But again, it's all about getting the balance right between flexibility and accountability. So, Presiding Officer, to close, this Parliament has a duty to ensure that the laws we pass are not only effective, but also transparent and democratically sound. The work of the DPLR Committee is just one part of that, but I hope that the report and today's debate have helped to move us all a step forward in strengthening that process. And I'd like to thank again everyone involved. It's been a pleasure to take part. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kidd. That concludes the debate on inquiry into framework legislation and Henry VIII powers, and it is now time to move on to the next item of business. In fact, there is one question to be put as a result of today's business. The question is that motion 17074, in the name of Stuart McMillan, on behalf of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, on inquiry into framework legislation and Henry VIII powers be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is agreed. Therefore, that concludes decision time, and I close this meeting.